Welcome to the Hyphen, Indian-American Dialogues. I'm your host, Sital Kalantry. In today's episode, we will talk about one of the most consequential developments in India-U.S. foreign relations in recent times, the U.S. India trade deal. Joining me today is a special guest, Salil Gupte, who is head of Boeing in India and South Asia. He oversees over 7,000 employees working on innovation in aerospace. Salil also serves on several boards, including the U.S. India Business Council. This gives him a unique vantage point into trade, geopolitics, and industry. I met Salil last week at a trade mission that was sponsored by the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce and the Greater Seattle Partners. We were at an event where Ambassador Gore, the new ambassador from the U.S. to India, paid us a visit. And right after that event, the trade deal was announced. So it was quite an exciting time. And I'm glad that you're joining us today, Salil. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited for our conversation. I know we just met last week in New Delhi at an event with the new U.S. ambassador, Sergio Gore, where we learned that night that the India-U.S. had reached a trade deal. So it was a really exciting moment to be there and be in India. And I wanted to get your thoughts as an industry leader on where things are. I know things are still evolving and not concrete, but how much do we know about the deal at this point?
Well, we know that absolutely, Sital. It's an ongoing discussion that we know is going to continue for the next several weeks and months, most likely. This is a process that kicked off last February when the Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C. with President Trump. They said they were going to work towards a bilateral trade agreement. Obviously, there were lots of things that happened in the interim, but here we are. And I think it was really important for the two governments to provide a concrete update, is the way I would put it, on where we are. And what that really means is talking through a broad framework of where it looks like we're coming to agreement. That's really what the joint statement was last Friday, where they talked about reduction in reciprocal tariff from the U.S. side down to 18%, where they talked about working on what was going to happen or how they were looking at some of the Section 232 tariffs, where they looked at an upcoming negotiation on several non-tariff barriers. I think one of the ones that got the most attention was the digital trade activity, but there's a number of other ones that industry has talked about with the Indian government and vice versa coming back the other way. And then there were some the wording has changed a little bit between the joint statement, the fact sheet, and the revised fact sheet. I think the word committed was used in one of the fact sheets, and I think it's been changed to intends. Ultimately, the goal of the United States is that the U.S. becomes a bigger part of India's import base, and I'm sure that'll continue to be part of the ongoing negotiation. So there's a lot going on there, but at a high level, those are some of the things that they discussed in the joint statement and then tried to discuss further in the fact sheet.
So it seems that a lot of this is still a framework to agree rather than a signed and sealed deal. In your experience, is this normal for this announcement to occur before things are completely finalized?
Well, I think we're across all of these deals with all of the countries that are talking to the United States right now. For all of this to be happening in parallel is something that's new for all of us to some extent. So it's hard to define what's normal and what's not. But I think there's very sound reasons to list why they would put out a statement now without necessarily having everything finalized and signed and ready to deliver. The biggest one is removing some uncertainty. Markets hate uncertainty. And so if you look at the financial markets in the US and India, they've been fairly volatile when it at least comes to trade or trade announcements. And removing some of that volatility is helpful because it's generally good for investors. And naturally, both of these governments tend to pay some attention to what happens in those markets. And so naturally, you'd expect them to do something that is supportive of investment and capital. That's one. Two is business investment decisions. You have many companies, both US companies like ours, making decisions here in India, and Indian companies looking to make decisions regarding the United States. These decisions are multi-year, sometimes multi-decade decisions. The longer you have no sense of where the trade negotiation is going, the harder it becomes to make those types of decisions, whether it's putting a new factory in one place or the other, whether it's deciding whether you're going to hire a ton of marketing people for an Indian company, say in the US, to really make the US one of your big export markets, whatever it is. And you don't want those decisions to be on hold. You want companies to be making those decisions as they go. Some guidance on where this agreement is heading is really, really helpful as we think about making those decisions in a timely manner. Additionally, there's the other deals that were going on. Remember, India is not happening in a vacuum here in terms of the negotiation with the U.S. There's deals with Southeast Asia, there's deals with Europe, and the government needs to get a sense for, as it frames up its own policies internally, tax and otherwise, where does India stand in terms of versus other countries. And I think I'll give you an example. Let's say there was a lot of talk a couple weeks ago about maintenance, repair, and overhaul on aircraft because the EU-India deal had a tariff or a duty that was going to go down from 11% to 0% for aerospace parts coming into India over some period of time. And because there hadn't been anything announced about the U.S. deal, at the time I was asked very bluntly at the air show that we had here, well, will your customers of a U.S. company, say Boeing, now be disadvantaged because there might be a higher tax on parts coming in from the U.S. than from Europe, and so it'll be more expensive to repair Boeing airplanes? And my answer was no, not really, because the government here has put an overriding rule on that caps customs duties, tariffs, what have you, on parts for repair and overhaul at a lower rate already. And so the government's already taken action to make sure that there's a level playing field when it comes to airplane maintenance. That's totally separate from these negotiations. But for the government to continue to make those types of calls, they have to know what the rules of engagement are around the varying trade negotiations. So there's all these different interlinkages between the varying conversations.
Yeah, and overall, it's a great thing to know that there is, a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think this is sort of like an engagement, and it's better to know that there's an engagement even if there isn't a marriage yet, for markets, as you say, for industry, and even the U.S. India relationship generally. But one concrete thing we do have is the reduction of the extra tariff, the extra 25% tariff that was placed on India for getting Russian oil. And I think that's, also helpful and beneficial. But do you see what are the opportunities that is talked about in the fact sheet in the joint statement is that India will endeavor to purchase $500 billion in goods. Do you see that happening, and do you see like the substitution of Venezuelan oil being able to come on board in the near future?
I mean, a lot on the second question. A lot depends on the ability of oil majors and others to be able to really make the most of the opportunity in Venezuela. I'm not an expert in that space, and so I'm not sure exactly the amount of investment that's going to take. I know, of course, there was a council of the major U.S. energy companies that was giving some perspective to the White House on that, and so we'll have to see how their opinion on that continues to evolve. It'll be interesting to see if the Indian industry, whether it's the large refiners here, are able to also perhaps play a role on a multinational basis in something like that. So we'll have to see what happens there. I think there are lots of other places where U.S. India trade will continue to increase, and so Indian purchases of U.S. goods naturally will increase, just as a matter of a growing Indian market and a rising Indian middle class. Of course, my business, airplanes and aerospace, is one of those. We know that India and the U.S. have become closer partners in defense over the last 20 years. The U.S. India defense trade was at zero at that time, and it has gone beyond $25 billion now over the last 20 years. We expect it'll continue to go higher. There's a number of deals that have been talked about in the media between India and the U.S. companies that we expect will occur in the coming, hopefully, year or so, and that'll contribute to the increase in trade. Additionally, we know that on the commercial aviation side, or civil aviation, tens of billions of dollars worth of deals between the U.S. and India, specifically for Boeing aircraft, have already been announced. I mean, we have over 500 orders in our order book here in India. That is, our orders for 500 airplanes in our order book here in India. I would say almost 425 plus of those were announced just in the last 3 years. And given the massive increase in the Indian civil aviation market and the fact that only 5% or fewer of Indians have ever flown a plane, that's going to continue to increase in the years to come. So that's just an example from my business. There's lots of other examples in other industries.
Yeah, and Boeing is a critical factor in the U.S. India trade. And I did want to specifically ask you about the 232 tariffs that were mentioned in the fact sheet. As it relates to your business in particular, can you talk about what they are and how it affects Boeing?
We can't really talk about it too much because we're a little bit in wait and see mode on those. At this point, they were linked to a number of executive orders around the Section 232 assessments that were going on. The fact sheet and the joint statement isn't fully clear yet on what the fate of those is going to be, and so we're still trying to get more information on those.
So, but what are the tariffs exactly? The 232 tariffs?
It's basically they're linked to national security. They're linked to under a national security provision, and they're linked to parts that are using certain types of materials, essentially, versus aluminum or others, and so they're ostensibly linked to those materials because of their impact on national security. But you see similar tariffs being used in pharma, or similar tariffs being discussed in pharmaceutical and other industries as well. And so, I don't want to say too much about it there because those assessments are continuing, and that's why I say we're in wait and see mode.
Sure. And the ideal, right, for India would be to have those tariffs reduced or removed because they would be able to provide parts to the automotive. To the airplane industry.
Yeah. I mean, I'll put it this way: whether you're talking about the Section 232 items or whether you're talking about broad-based other items, the aerospace industry has always said that a zero for zero tariff environment is what is ideal for this business. And now that sounds a little bit self-serving because every industry is going to say that they should be in a free trade environment. But aerospace is a little bit special because it has a impact on two areas of collaboration between nations. One is national security, which is incredibly important priority for all of us. And India and the U.S. are important partners here in the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore having a tariff-free environment there in terms of industrial collaboration is really, really important. The other is infrastructure. The airplanes that Boeing makes and that India supports the manufacturing of through its supply chain here, and the billions of dollars that Indian parts across OEMs, not just Boeing, that flow from India to around the world. Those support the connection of people through airplane travel around the world, and that supports trade. And there's no other industry that can really say that. I mean, I don't want to name, I don't want to pick on anyone, but even if you're talking about huge industries like automotive or rail or what have you, they don't connect people as much intercontinentally as aviation and aerospace do. And so I think that puts our business in a bit of a special place.
Great, thank you for that elaboration. So there, as I was in India when this deal was announced, reading the papers every day, you felt this was a really important moment. Whereas, sort of reading the online American papers, it was sort of mentioned, but, as a below the fold story. So in India, there was a lot of hot button politics around it, right? Particularly how is agriculture going to be placed? Because it's a very much of a domestic issue. The agriculture industry, the farmers are worried about the international or the U.S. Exports harming their business. And of course, in the U.S. we have a big agriculture industry as well that needs markets. So that seemed to be a hot button issue. And are there other hot button issues that you observe as you sit in your vantage point in India?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to take a step back. First, to your point about how this was being followed in the U.S. versus India, there's certain topics in India that get a tremendous amount of attention, and naturally, trade is one of them. National security is another one. India has significant security threats on its borders, and so it's always paying attention to issues of national security. In the U.S., when the U.S. is, of course, involved in engagements in the Middle East or wherever over the last 2 decades, naturally people pay attention, but at other times people pay less attention. It's similar on trade. The U.S. has a lot of these trade negotiations going on, so the attention given to any one of them perhaps will be a little bit less. In India, this is a huge deal for the economy, as you would expect, and India is negotiating deals, as was announced a few weeks ago, with the EU and others, but the U.S. one is one of the largest ones, and so you'd expect it to get a lot of play in the press. You'd also expect it to be, as you called it out, as a hot button political issue, and that's the second piece of this. India has always been a country since independence that prioritizes its sense of sovereignty, and is very proud of that. India famously was part of what it called the non-aligned movement for decades during the Cold War, and Minister Jaishankar has, of course, published books, the foreign minister, about the India way, about how India takes things forward in this world in which we live today, as we move to, I guess, the second third coming up here of the 21st century. In all of that, certain representations of sovereignty are always going to be very important, and they're going to come into play, therefore, into domestic politics. So some of this is the economic interests of individual constituencies, but some of this is about that sense of sovereignty. When you talk about agriculture, of course, half of the Indian economy remains agricultural based. The farmers are a huge constituency for anyone who's looking in any state election or national election. And by the way, that's similar to the way it is in the U.S., where in so much of the heartland of America, agricultural communities are a huge voice in everything that happens in American politics. So this should be no surprise, or should be very familiar to Americans, that this would be a big topic in India in terms of what the agricultural piece of trade looks like, whether it's on things like pulses or dairy, or some of these things that have been part of the loud voice of the ag community in India. That's number one. The other piece that you'll see is companies and industries that are very important to the economy, even if they don't have as huge a piece of the employment. non-tariff barrier conversation around digital technologies, I guess, is one way to put it. I think in India they called it the quote unquote Google tax, where there was, of course, taxes on advertising. I think a couple of years ago those taxes went away, and everyone is kind of wondering about, as a result of this negotiation, what happens with India's ability to make decisions on taxing that going forward. It's to be determined. But I think even though that's not a largest constituency as the farmers, it's a big part of the economy of both countries, and you imagine it'll be a hot button issue.
Right, particularly for the U.S., where these businesses are based, the digital
Yep.
services, right? I can imagine the lobbying that's going on behind the scenes. So, what are you looking out for when you think, okay, I these are like the top three issues that I would love to get clarity on?
Yeah, well, number one, I think, as you mentioned, the Section 232 assessments and activities still going on, still be discussed. We, in the aerospace and aviation business, our number one priority is zero for zero. That's what we've always advocated for under the various trade agreements since 1979. That has been the baseline for aerospace and aviation around the world, and we want to see that continue through all of these, be a common thread through all of these bilateral trade agreements. It is the case between the U.S. and the EU countries already. We would naturally want that for the U.S. and India because we want a level playing field. We don't want a situation where, in one country we're doing something with our supply chain and it's subject to these types of tariffs, and in another country it's subject to something completely different, because then that starts to distort what the global supply chains of aerospace and aviation look like. And that has implications for a lot of things, national security being one of them. So given that, you want zero for zero on aviation and aerospace. And the soonest time that we can have clarity around that, I think the better, which will be good. I think after that, you're looking at, I think, some of the clarity around, at least for us, around non-tariff barriers. And there's a lot of those in aviation, aerospace, in the defense trades, not so much on the commercial and civil aviation side, but on the defense side, you do see some of that where certain elements of Indian procurement are limited to Indian firms. And we've talked very candidly with the government about this, and the example of other countries like Australia, where, say, Boeing Australia is treated basically like an Australian company. It's of course registered there, pays taxes there, employs thousands of Australians, and therefore was able to develop aircraft platforms in Australia for the Royal Australian Air Force. We believe that is an example of what we can do here in India. India wants to partner more with the U.S. in defense. India wants to partner on development of platforms here, and the U.S. companies can help with that. But in order to do that fully, it's helpful to be treated like an Indian company would be. And Boeing India, which again employs thousands of people, pays taxes, is registered here, which I chair, it would be incredibly useful for us to be treated similarly the way we are in Australia, and that would make that collaboration much more fluid. And I think that's a very specific example of, I think, something that could be considered a non-tariff barrier, because if you don't have that freedom, it becomes harder to execute that type of mission. There are much broader examples in other industries, the digital trade requirements, where data centers are hosted, where the data is for some of our credit card companies, where all of that is hosted, social media regulations. There's tons of stuff that as the past chairman of AmCham, I know is under discussion, but lies a little bit outside my area of expertise. I know that all of our member companies in AmCham are looking forward to getting the most clarity they possibly can on that. So I think that would be the second, is the non-tariff barriers. I think a distant third is clarity around the large numbers that are being thrown around in terms of purchases by India. There's so much talk in the press about that, and politics around that. Is this a commitment? Is this an intention? People are wrangling about the $500 billion number that was put out there. I said, my position is it's that's a distant third for me, because that number is going to grow as the U.S. India relationship grows. The U.S. India relationship has been on such an amazing trajectory over the last really 25, 30 years. As long as that trajectory remains positive, I know that number is going to get to where it should be. And so I'm a little bit less worried about, what number everyone's fixated on today, because it's just going to be moving up and to the right.
Yeah. You talked about Indian politics, right? Well, one thing that I observed, right, when I was there was it was the opposition clearly wants to paint this as too much of a concession on the
Mm-hmm.
part of the prime minister. And whether it's true or not is a different question, and whether what the facts are actually is also up to debate. But in our politics here in the U.S., that's really not a factor. We don't hear the Democrats saying, "Oh, wow, Trump gave up too much to India." It's almost like they don't that we don't care, or it doesn't even matter. We don't for us. It's really maybe matters for the administration, not really the people or
Mm-hmm.
the Democrats. It matters for President Trump whether he feels, he's getting the
Yeah.
best bargain or the best deal, which is an interesting counterpoint that I wanted to observe.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a couple things going on there. First, it is the role of any healthy opposition in any country to give their countervailing perspective around anything that's going on, especially a trade deal. I think you expect that from any opposition, and the Indian opposition is doing that. And if they want to raise up certain questions to have a healthy debate, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to, take sides between one way or the other,
Right.
but that debate is good for any robust and vibrant democracy. And if anything else, India has shown the vibrancy of its democracy over the past 5 years, decade, in both the center elections, the elections for the center and parliament, and of course the many state elections. So I expect nothing less than that debate in India when you have something of such a prominent topic come up. So I'll put it that way. I think in terms of why it's top of mind here and maybe not as discussed in the U.S. amongst the opposition there is, one, there's lots of other topics that the opposition perhaps in the U.S. is focused on at the moment, around. Well, I think everyone can see the headlines are in the U.S. and they know what those topics are around, immigration and other factors, cultural factors, debates. In many other areas beyond trade. I think that's one. I think the other thing is simply where this trade agreement sits in the long cycle of development for the countries. So the exact percentage that the U.S. and India agree on for the U.S. economy at its current state of development affects a certain number of industries and constituents that are employed or affected by those industries. And for example, agriculture, where in the U.S. you have a ton of farmers in the heartland, but then you also have the reality that much agriculture in the U.S. is industrialized, and there are some very large ag companies in the U.S. that have a lot at stake, and of course they'll have loud voices, but the individual farmers are fewer in number as a percentage of ag in the U.S. In India, the individual farmers are a huge, huge part of the constituency. And so given that importance, you would expect these terms to be a topic of greater debate. And because they're a topic of greater debate, they're seized upon in politics more than they would be in the U.S. So there's a few factors there that are very different as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Explanation of the differences. Anything else that you wanted to cover that I didn't maybe?
I think for us, the U.S. India relationship is this long arc of relationship building over a 25, 30-year period. And if you go back and you think to President George W. Bush, and you think about President Obama's policies, and you think about President Trump policy in his first term, and President Biden, and now President Trump, and you go back and you think about Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Modi. These are personalities that are so different from one another. These are personalities that have policies and politics that are so different from one another. And yet, the trajectory of the U.S. India relationship has generally been extremely positive, has been growing closer together, and has really leveraged its people-to-people ties to become stronger in every single area over a 2.5-decade span. I think many people will tell you that the past year has been disruptive to that. Certainly some of the biggest disruption we've seen over that quarter century. But it is just that. It is a disruption that will end and is in the process of ending with the joint statement and getting to a bilateral trade deal. And I think we'll resume on that trajectory. And I expect the next 25 years to go pretty much as the last 25 years have, in terms of stronger partnership in all of these industries, mine included, aerospace and aviation and defense, but also on technology and lots of other places. So, I think this is so closely watched because this relationship is so important.
Yeah, and I think that you're totally right that this agreement is really symbolic of a larger relationship coming together again, right? That there's a road bump, or we didn't know what it was. It was a huge about face in the relationship, right? People are saying it's the worst ever that it's been in 25 years, right? Or since, as you know, earlier with the non-alignment movement, as you mentioned, there was a desire on the part of India to actually not be engaged with the U.S., but that changed post, liberalization quite a bit. So we're glad to see that this might be getting things back on track, getting defense back on track, politics back on track, the people-to-people connections back on track, with this positive development in the trade deal.
I would agree. I would agree with all that. I think it's people can have their perspectives on how this compares to post 1998 and the sanctions that then had to be dealt with as part of the civil nuclear deal. And I'm not an expert to compare, but I'm looking to the future as this gets done, where we go from here, and I expect that trajectory to be pretty positive.
That's great. Glad to hear it. And thank you so much for being here and for your time and insights. You have a great insights given your both American connection and the long time you've spent in the U.S. and now being situated in India.
And the long time the 10 years that I spent in Seattle. So go Hawks.
Go Hawks. Yes. Today was our big parade. And,
congrats.
Yeah. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
To have you. If you enjoyed this episode of The Hyphen, please hit the like button, share it, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. I want to give a special thanks to Ashni Jagtiani and Shannon Young, as well as Social Sherpa, our producers. A special thanks to our media partner, India Abroad,